Segment 1, Why It Sucked to Live in Victorian London. Part 1, the narrow alleyways of Victorian London were filled with the sounds of endless hustle, but they were far from the cheerful murmur of a vibrant city. Instead, they echoed with the miserable cries of its impoverished citizens, scraping by in a world that offered little hope. The air, thick with smog, carried the fetid stench of waste and disease, making it almost unbearable to breathe. The city, like its slums, was a paradox, the epitome of industrial advancement on the one hand, but a breeding ground for poverty and squalor on the other. The slums, often called rookery districts, were overcrowded, with families packed into the smallest spaces imaginable. It was common for entire households to live in a single room, separated only by flimsy curtains or boards. The room might have a single bed, a fire pit in the corner, and a few meager possessions that had to be shared by everyone. Yet, in these cramped, dark spaces, people managed to survive day by day, as bleak as the reality was. The architecture of these hovels was as cruel as the conditions. Crooked, leaning houses built of cheap wood or brick, with no windows in the lower floors to prevent the damp from seeping in. The walls were stained with moisture, and the smell of mold permeated the air. In the heart of these neighborhoods, children played in the streets, their faces covered in grime, their clothes tattered and soaked in the ever-present muck of the streets. The children's clothing was nothing more than rags stitched together, unable to shield them from the harsh cold or the filth around them. Their hair, matted and unkempt, was often the only part of them visible as they scampered barefoot through the muck. These children had no idea what it was like to be free from the weight of hardship, their innocent eyes clouded with the knowledge that their lives were already mapped out for them, tied to a system that offered them nothing but labor and suffering. As for the adults, the men would often leave early in the morning, heading to the factories or to the docks for long, grueling workdays that paid hardly enough to cover their families' needs. Their clothes were worn to the point of disintegration, frayed coats and threadbare trousers that were a far cry from the polished, stiff collars and tailored jackets worn by those in the upper echelons of society. These garments had become symbols of their struggle, a testament to their status as expendable cogs in the machinery of industry. The women, too, had no choice but to toil from dawn until dusk, their hands calloused from scrubbing floors, washing clothes, and working the same factories as their husbands, yet still earning less than a fraction of what the men made. Yet, despite the conditions, the streets were never silent. The sounds of the slum were a mixture of laughter, cries, and the clanging of metal, but they were always tinged with an undercurrent of despair. The poor had learned to survive amidst the filth, clinging to the small moments of joy that could be found in a shared meal or a kind word between neighbors. But for most, the idea of a better life seemed as distant as the stars in the smog-choked sky. No one was free from the weight of their circumstances. It was a perpetual struggle for survival that would continue until death claimed them. This was Victorian London's underbelly, a world of grinding poverty, where every breath felt like an act of defiance, and every step forward was just another attempt to escape the crushing weight of a city that cared little for its most vulnerable. The rich may have dined in grand halls and paraded through clean streets, but here, in the slums, life was a battle, a constant struggle just to make it through the day. Part 2. As dawn broke over Victorian London, the air was thick with the acrid scent of burning coal and the distant rumble of steam engines. In the slums, the working poor were already stirring from their meager slumbers, preparing for another long day in a city that had little mercy for its lower classes. The streets were dark, even at the first light of day, the smoke from industrial chimneys hanging in the air, blotting out any trace of sunlight. The sun barely touched the cobblestone streets, leaving them damp and slick with a layer of soot. For the working poor, every moment was marked by the need to survive, and surviving meant long, grueling hours of labor. Men, women, and children all moved with purpose, heading toward the factories, docks, or markets where they would spend their days. They wore clothes that were barely recognizable as such. Tattered coats, patched trousers, and dresses that had been repaired and repurposed so many times that they were little more than scraps of fabric stitched together. The women, often mothers and wives, wore simple dresses with thick, worn aprons tied tightly around their waists. Their shoes, if they had any, were cobbled together from worn-out leather, and the soles were threadbare, offering little protection from the cold, wet ground. Their faces were marked by the years of hard labor, their eyes hollowed from lack of sleep, their bodies bent from the physical toll of the work. The factories were the heart of the Industrial Revolution, but for the working poor, they were prisons. The machines inside them were loud, oppressive, and unforgiving. Men, and increasingly women and children, were forced to work in dangerous, cramped conditions where accidents were commonplace. The air was thick with dust, and the heat from the machines created an unbearable, stifling atmosphere. Workers spent hours on end operating looms, tending to boilers, or working the mines. The factories were poorly ventilated, and the constant hum of machines, the shuffling of feet, and the ringing of hammers became the soundtrack of their lives. For the men, the factory was often a place of physical destruction. They worked in conditions that left them covered in soot, their faces blackened, their hands blistered from the constant strain. The jobs they performed were repetitive and backbreaking, leaving little room for any kind of reprieve. The women's roles were no less grueling. They spent their days in front of sewing machines or performing the menial tasks of scrubbing, cleaning, or sorting, often in conditions that were both physically demanding and emotionally draining. Some worked in the sweatshops, cramped rooms where they sewed garments for the wealthy, earning only pennies for hours of labor. The work was tedious, with no time for rest or comfort. The women's fingers were raw from handling needles and fabric, and their backs ached from the constant hunching over their tasks. Children were not spared from the horrors of factory life. In fact, they were often the most exploited. Small, nimble fingers were perfect for reaching into the tight spaces of machinery, and the owners of factories took full advantage of this. Children as young as 5 were sent to work in the factories, their small bodies enduring the same grueling hours as the adults. Their clothes were even more ragged, and their faces bore the signs of malnutrition and exhaustion. The sound of their laughter, if ever heard, was drowned out by the clatter of machines and the grim reality of their lives. Some children worked in the coal mines, crawling through tunnels no larger than a small child's body. Others worked in the mills, their fingers moving swiftly through the looms, their eyes straining in the dim light. In the evenings, the workers would return to their overcrowded homes, exhausted from the day's labor. They had no time for leisure or rest. There was no such thing as a day off in the slums. Every day was a battle for survival. The air in the homes was just as stifling as in the factories, filled with the scent of burning coal and the sound of coughing, as tuberculosis spread like wildfire through the slums. Disease was rampant, and the working poor had little recourse. There were no hospitals nearby, and the few doctors who did serve the area were either too expensive or too busy to help. The children, too, were affected by the harsh conditions. They played in the streets, but their games were different from those of other children in wealthier parts of London. They learned to dodge the filth of the streets, to avoid the dangerous alleyways where crime often ran rampant. Their lives were already mapped out for them, and it was a future that seemed bleak and unchangeable. Some would become factory workers like their parents, while others might find themselves in the streets, begging for scraps, living a life that seemed no better than the one they had been born into. In this relentless world of hardship, the working poor in Victorian London learned to endure, to survive. But even in their darkest moments, they had one thing: the hope, however small, that their lives might someday be better. For now, it was enough to simply survive another day. Part 3. Queen Victoria was born in 1819, in a world that was a far cry from the grim realities of the slums that lay beneath the grandeur of her reign. raised in relative isolation in Kensington Palace. She grew up with an intense sense of duty and a longing for stability in a world that was in constant flux. Her early years were marked by the absence of a loving mother, as her family was divided by political intrigue and the pressures of royal life. She was kept largely away from the affairs of state, and the way to the throne seemed a distant concern until the day she ascended to the throne in 1837, at the tender age of 18. Victoria's reign would go on to define an era known as the Victorian era, but it was one that was wrought with personal struggle and public duty. As queen, she became the symbol of British imperial might, overseeing an empire that spanned continents and stretched across the globe. Yet behind the pomp and circumstance of her royal duties, Victoria was a woman torn between the demands of monarchy and the challenges of her personal life. From the moment she became queen, Victoria's life was no longer her own. She was thrust into the public eye, her every move scrutinized, and her every decision subject to the judgment of her subjects. As queen, she was expected to embody the virtues of the British Empire: duty, morality, and strength. But in her personal life, she struggled with intense loneliness and the overwhelming pressure of her responsibilities. She married her cousin, Prince Albert, in 1840, a union that was seen as both politically advantageous and personally fulfilling. Together, they had 9 children, and their relationship was marked by deep affection. Albert, however, was not only her husband but also her trusted advisor, and she relied heavily on him throughout the early years of their marriage. Despite the outward success of their union, Victoria's reign was marked by a series of challenges that shook her to her core. She faced political upheaval, including the Chartist movement demanding universal suffrage and workers' rights, and the growing power of the colonies, which often led to tensions within the empire. Her relationship with the British prime ministers was often strained, as she struggled to assert her authority while managing the politics of an ever-changing government. Yet, it was the death of Prince Albert in 1861 that left a deep, indelible mark on her life. Prince Albert's death sent Victoria into a state of mourning that lasted for years. Her grief was profound, and her public persona, once that of a strong, assured monarch, crumbled. She withdrew from public life, retreating to her estates, and her absence from royal duties became a subject of scandal. The queen, once the embodiment of imperial strength, had become a shell of herself, unable to cope with the loss of her beloved husband. Her mourning was seen as a national tragedy, as her melancholic state mirrored the growing tensions within the empire. Yet despite her grief, Queen Victoria continued to rule. She made several attempts to reconnect with her subjects and to regain the strength and resolve that had defined her earlier years. In the latter part of her reign, she became more involved in public duties once again, though the heavy burdens of her personal life and the weight of the empire's problems continued to haunt her. Queen Victoria's reign saw the British Empire expand to its greatest extent. Under her rule, the empire became a global superpower, stretching from the colonies in India to the dominions of Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. The British Navy dominated the seas, and London became the cultural and economic center of the world. Yet, as the empire grew, so did the problems that came with it. Rising nationalism in the colonies, the growing call for democratic reforms at home, and increasing tensions between the working classes and the aristocracy. Victoria's reign also coincided with the rise of the Industrial Revolution, which brought about profound social change. The wealth and power of Britain were built upon the backs of the working poor, whose lives were defined by the very conditions that Victoria's government struggled to address. The contrast between the opulence of the royal court and the poverty of the slums was stark, and as the industrial age moved forward, the Queen's relationship with her subjects became increasingly strained. Yet, despite her struggles, Queen Victoria remained a symbol of the British monarchy. Steadfast, unyielding, and ultimately, a queen whose personal pain was often hidden beneath the regal facade that she had crafted for herself. In the final years of her life, Queen Victoria came to terms with her legacy, both as a ruler and as a woman. She was a figure who had seen both the grandeur and the squalor of her empire, and who had come to understand that her role as monarch was as much about managing her own heartache as it was about managing an empire. In her death, she became a symbol not just of an era, but the contradictions that defined it. A queen who ruled an empire built on industry and inequality. A woman whose personal life was as complex and troubled as the world she governed. Queen Victoria passed away in 1901, after a reign that spanned 63 years. Her death marked the end of the Victorian era and the beginning of a new century. Yet, even in death, she remained an enduring figure. Her legacy both a reflection of the grand achievements of the British Empire and a reminder of the personal sacrifices that often went unnoticed in the pages of history. Part 4. In stark contrast to the abject poverty of the slums, the upper echelons of Victorian society lived in an entirely different world, one of opulence, refinement, and unimaginable wealth. The Victorian upper class, while isolated from the daily struggles of the working poor, also had their own set of expectations and burdens, dictated by social norms and rigid class structures. These elite members of society lived in grand mansions, adorned in luxurious clothing, and hosted lavish parties. But even their world had its own set of unspoken rules and quiet despair. The mansions of the wealthy were majestic, their architecture a reflection of the empire's grandeur and the industrial age's new wealth. The homes were constructed from the finest materials, with expansive gardens, intricate woodwork, and soaring ceilings that seemed to touch the heavens. The walls were adorned with expensive paintings, and the floors were covered with plush carpets, thick enough to dampen the sound of footsteps. Each room was a masterpiece of design, with intricate wallpaper, gilded furniture, and chandeliers that cast soft, golden light over everything. These palatial estates were often set far from the noisy, smoke-filled streets of London, in the more serene suburbs, where the air was still and the gardens were in full bloom. Inside these homes, life was a constant display of wealth and status. The aristocrats wore clothes made from the finest fabrics, silk, velvet, and satin. The men donned tailored suits, adorned with cravats and waistcoats, their top hats perched perfectly atop their heads. The women were draped in elegant gowns that trailed behind them like flowing rivers of lace and satin. Their dresses were adorned with intricate embroidery, beads, and jewels, which shimmered under the soft lighting. Corsets were tightly laced to emphasize their narrow waists, while high-neck collars and elaborate hairstyles completed their aristocratic look. Even their shoes were fine leather, polished to a mirror shine, and their gloves were always immaculate, never a speck of dirt in sight. The servants in these grand homes played a crucial role in maintaining the illusion of perfection. They moved quietly through the rooms, ensuring that every need of their masters was attended to. The upper class would rarely be seen without a servant in close proximity, whether it was a butler in the drawing room, a maid in the kitchen, or a footman at the door. Every detail of their lives was managed by the unseen hands of others. The servants themselves were often treated with cold formality, regarded more as tools than people, their lives rarely intersecting with those of their employers beyond the duties they were assigned. The social calendar for the wealthy was filled with events designed to maintain their position in the social hierarchy. Balls, galas, and formal dinners were a common occurrence. These grand events were not merely about entertainment, but rather about showcasing wealth, status, and influence. Guests would arrive in elaborate carriages, their horses well-groomed and adorned with fine leather harnesses. Inside, the rooms would be filled with the soft hum of polite conversation, the clinking of crystal glasses, and the sweet notes of live orchestras. The food was extravagant, with multiple courses served on silver platters, each more decadent than the last. Champagne flowed freely, and guests danced waltzes beneath grand chandeliers, their steps synchronized to the rhythm of the music. However, this lavish life was not without its own set of challenges. Beneath the veneer of wealth and happiness, Many in the upper class found themselves trapped in lives dictated by duty and societal expectation. Marriages were often arranged for political or financial gain rather than love. Women, though celebrated for their beauty and grace, were expected to fulfill strict roles as wives and mothers. Their personal desires often sacrificed for the sake of the family and the estate. The idea of duty weighed heavily on the aristocracy, and the pressure to maintain social standing and uphold family reputation often led to deep dissatisfaction. For men, life was often marked by long hours in the business world or in politics, where power was wielded behind closed doors. They were expected to maintain their wealth, manage the family estate, and ensure that their name carried the same prestige it had for generations. This left little room for personal pursuits or desires, and many found themselves alienated from their families and even from their own happiness. The women, on the other hand, faced a different kind of confinement. Despite their beauty and elegance, their lives were confined to the domestic sphere. They had little say in the management of their finances or the running of their household. Their worth was often measured by their ability to produce heirs and maintain the family name. The young women of the Victorian upper class were raised with the expectation that their ultimate goal was to marry well, preferably to someone of equal or higher social status. Love, if it came, was often secondary to this primary goal. Yet, despite these challenges, the upper class in Victorian England lived in a world of luxury that was beyond the imagination of the working poor. They had access to the best education, the finest food, and the most exclusive social circles. They could travel the world, live in palatial estates, and enjoy a life free from the constant struggle for survival that defined the lives of so many of their fellow countrymen. But even in the opulence of their estates and the grandeur of their social events, the upper class could not escape the reality of society that was rapidly changing. The rise of industrialization and the growing power of the working class threatened the social order that had once defined Victorian England. The aristocracy, despite their wealth and privilege, began to sense that their world was slipping away from them, and with it, the sense of power and control that had once been so assured. In the end, the lives of the Victorian upper class were as complex and contradictory as those of the working poor. They may have lived in palaces, but their lives were shaped by the same forces that shaped the lives of those in the slums: duty, expectation, and a relentless march of time. They, too, were trapped in a system that demanded their compliance, and while they may have enjoyed luxury and privilege, they could never escape the reality of their own limitations. Part 5. The streets of Whitechapel were dark and damp, the fog swirling with an eerie stillness as night descended upon London. The gas lamps flickered in the oppressive mist, casting long, distorted shadows that seemed to move with the whisper of the wind. In the slums of the East End, the air was heavy with the stench of decay, both from the accumulated refuse in the alleyways and from the dismal lives of those who called this part of London home. But beneath the dark surface of the city, there existed an even darker, more chilling reality, one that would forever haunt the streets of Victorian London. Jack the Ripper, the name that would send shivers down the spine of every Londoner, was an enigma, a ghost who moved through the night with terrifying precision, leaving behind a trail of blood, fear, and unsolved mysteries. His first known victim was Mary Ann Nichols, found in the early hours of August 31st, 1888, lying in the gutter, her body grotesquely mutilated. The scene was horrific, a sight that seemed to defy the imagination, one that would mark the beginning of a series of brutal killings that would terrorize the city for months. The Ripper's method was chillingly methodical. His victims were prostitutes, women who live on the fringes of society, already marginalized and forgotten by many. They were the most vulnerable, easy prey in a part of London where darkness seemed to swallow up the faintest hint of hope. Each murder was more grotesque than the last, with the killer displaying a cruel expertise in anatomy. making cuts so precise that it suggested a knowledge of the human body far beyond what was expected from a common murderer. The police, in their attempt to uncover the Ripper's identity, found themselves at a loss, unable to catch the elusive killer despite their best efforts. In the slums of Whitechapel, whispers spread like wildfire. The women who worked the streets, too frightened to speak openly, kept their heads low and walked quickly, their eyes darting over their shoulders with every passing stranger. The fear of the Ripper was palpable, a silent terror that wrapped itself around the hearts of all who lived in the shadow of his murders. The sense of safety that once existed, even in the harshest of conditions, had evaporated completely. Now, every man in the alley could be a potential killer. Every shadow could conceal a dangerous predator. For the residents of Whitechapel, the Ripper's killings were more than just a series of brutal murders. They were a symbol of the stark divide between the rich and the poor, a grim reminder that even in the heart of the great Victorian Empire, the poorest, most vulnerable were often the first to suffer. The killer was not just a man. He was a manifestation of the darkness that lurked beneath the shiny surface of Victorian society. He was a reminder of the ever-present threat that poverty, crime, and neglect brought to the lives of the working poor. The police investigation was marred by confusion, misdirection, and a series of false leads. The public, gripped by fear and curiosity, offered up theories, some rational and others fantastical. Was the killer a member of the upper class, hidden behind a veil of respectability, using his wealth and position to evade suspicion? Or was he simply a deranged figure, driven by an unfathomable thirst for blood? The lack of conclusive evidence only deepened the mystery, and the Ripper became both a symbol of the terror that plagued the poor and a subject of fascination for the more privileged classes who could sit comfortably at their parlors, far removed from the streets where the blood flowed freely. The women of Whitechapel were the ones who felt the deepest horror. They were the ones who walked the dark streets, faced the oppressive stares of men, and endured the constant threat of violence. Their lives had always been fragile, but now, with the Ripper on the loose, their very existence felt tenuous. They were most vulnerable in the city, without a stable home, without the protection of wealth, without the safety of the social structures that sheltered others. They were the ones who knew, more than anyone, how easily life could slip away in the darkness. The killing spree continued throughout the fall of 1888, with the victims becoming more mutilated and the public's fear escalating with every passing week. The police were relentless, but they were unable to capture the killer. And as the days dragged on, the Ripper's reign of terror seemed to stretch on endlessly. The murderer was elusive, his identity as hidden as the truth behind the crimes. The case eventually went cold, the killer vanishing as mysteriously as he had arrived. In the end, Jack the Ripper became a symbol of the grotesque nature of the era, a figure whose terror embodied the fractured and decaying fabric of Victorian society. His killings were not just the actions of a madman, but a stark reminder of the deep-seated inequalities that plague London, of a world where the poorest, the most vulnerable, were left to suffer, while the rest of the city continued to turn a blind eye. And though the Ripper's identity was never discovered, his legacy lived on, etched into the dark corners of the Victorian psyche. A chilling tale of terror, mystery, and the horrors that lie hidden in the shadows. Part 6. Amidst the bleakness of Whitechapel and pervasive fear that gripped the slums, the Victorian upper class continued their lives in stark contrast, surrounded by the luxuries of wealth, privilege, and comfort, while the working poor lived in cramped, disease-ridden tenements. The wealthy resided in opulent mansions that stood as symbols of their status, protected from the harsh realities of the streets by both physical and social distance. Their existence seemed worlds apart from the suffering of the slums, but it too was bound by the unspoken pressures and responsibilities of Victorian society. The grand homes of the aristocracy were architectural marvels, designed not only for comfort, but also for display. Imposing facades, often built from gleaming stone, lined the quiet, tree-lined avenues where the upper class sought refuge from the grime and noise of the industrial city. Inside, the rooms were vast, with high ceilings adorned with intricate plasterwork and towering windows that flooded the spaces with natural light. The floors were covered with fine Persian rugs, and the walls were lined with rare tapestries and works of art that conveyed the wealth and taste of the owners. In the drawing rooms, long sofas were draped in luxurious fabrics, with tables laden with delicate porcelain and crystal, reflecting the wealth of society that had reaped the benefits of empire and industry. The homes of the wealthy were as much about the expression of power as they were about comfort. Every detail, from the placement of furniture to the arrangement of paintings, was designed to project an image of refined taste, sophistication, and wealth. The gas lamps that lit the rooms cast a soft, warm glow, complementing the plush velvet curtains that framed the windows, while the fireplaces, which crackled with warmth, served as a focal point of many a grand gathering. Social events were an integral part of the aristocratic lifestyle. The upper class spent much of their time attending balls, dinners, and theater performances, where networking and maintaining their position in society were just as important as the enjoyment of the event itself. In the glittering halls of their homes, aristocrats hosted extravagant soirees where they mingled with other influential figures. The women wore layers of satin and silk, their corsets laced tightly to emphasize their figures, while men donned finely tailored suits and top hats. Their lives were meticulously crafted to reflect their social standing. There was little room for personal expression outside constraints of propriety and duty. Despite the external opulence, the lives of the upper class were not without their own form of imprisonment. The weight of social expectation was constant, and the aristocracy was often bound by invisible chains of tradition and obligation. Marriage, for example, was not a matter of romantic choice for many. It was often a transaction, a means of consolidating wealth and securing political alliances. For women, particularly, marriage was an expectation and a duty. They were raised to be wives and mothers, to manage households and produce heirs. Love and affection, though idealized, were secondary concerns to securing of family lineage and the continuation of wealth. While the women were confined to their domestic roles, the men of the upper class faced their own burdens. They were expected to manage estates, uphold the family name, and engage in public life, often through politics or business ventures. But even with all their wealth and power, the men were not immune to the pressures of society. Their time was consumed by managing investments, engaging in philanthropic endeavors to maintain their reputation, and ensuring that their families remained at the top of the social hierarchy. Many sought solace in private indulgences, gambling, drinking, and affairs, though these pursuits, too, were fraught with their own risks and consequences. The children of the upper class, like their parents, were raised within a rigid set of expectations. Their education was carefully curated to ensure that they were prepared to inherit the family's wealth and status. Boys were sent to prestigious schools, where they were trained in the arts of leadership, governance, and warfare, while girls were taught to run households and engage in the cultural pursuits expected of women of their standing. Both were conditioned to carry the weight of their social role from a young age, prepared to continue the cycle of wealth and privilege that had been passed down through generations. Yet, for all their wealth and social standing, the upper class in Victorian England was not immune to the darker forces of society. The pressure to maintain their status often led to a quiet but pervasive form of emotional strain. The anxiety of losing one's position in society was a constant fear, and the tragedies of the slums, poverty, disease, and crime could not be entirely ignored. Even the wealthiest families had their secrets, hidden behind the high walls of their estates. Scandals, affairs, and even financial ruin sometimes lurked beneath the polished surface of their lives. As the Industrial Revolution progressed, the growing divide between the rich and the poor became more pronounced, and the aristocracy found themselves increasingly out of touch with the lives of the working class. The rapid rise of industry and the expansion of the British Empire had fueled their wealth, But it also created a society in which the lower classes, struggling to survive in the shadow of progress, began to demand change. This tension between the haves and the have-nots would only grow, eventually leading to social movements that sought to address the inequality that had been ignored for so long. Yet, within the gilded confines of their world, the upper class of Victorian England continued to enjoy a lifestyle that most could only dream of. The grand estates, the opulent clothing, the fine dining, and the social events, all were part of a carefully constructed world that, to many, seemed both perfect and unattainable. But behind the curtains of this privileged life lay the pressure to maintain appearances, the fear of scandal, and the knowledge that, in a world shifting rapidly under the weight of industry and change, no position, no matter how high, was ever truly secure. Segment 2, the biography of Queen Victoria. Part 1, the streets of Victorian London were a cacophony of misery and survival. In the slums, everything felt suffocating, from the oppressive fog that thickened the air to the overcrowded alleyways where children ran barefoot through the mud. Life in the slums was a struggle for every breath, every scrap of food, every ounce of warmth. It wasn't just external conditions of poverty that made it unbearable. It was a social system that left little room for escape, trapping the working poor in an unending cycle of hardship. The very architecture of the slums seemed designed to crush the spirit. The narrow streets, lined with poorly constructed houses, were often so cramped that the sunlight never reached the lower floors. The buildings, many of which were leaning precariously, had crumbling facades, and the walls of the homes were often damp and covered in mildew. The stench of refuse was inescapable. Waste piled up in the corners of alleyways, stagnant water collecting in the streets, turning them into foul, open sewers. The air was thick with the acrid smoke from nearby factories, and the low, constant hum of machinery seemed to mirror the mechanical lives of the inhabitants who had no choice but to endure. The children who lived in these wretched conditions had no concept of freedom. They grew up surrounded by filth, disease, and the constant hum of city life, which was more violent than rhythmic. Their faces were often streaked with dirt, their clothes in tatters, and their spirits worn down by the daily fight for survival. Unlike the children of the upper class, who were sheltered from the harshness of life, the children of the slums were born into it, and it was all they knew. They played in the streets, but their games were not innocent. They learned early on how to dodge carts, how to avoid the drunken men who sometimes lingered in the alleyways, and how to survive the violence and despair that colored every aspect of their world. The most heart-wrenching aspect of life in the slums was the utter lack of opportunity. Education, even for the most curious and ambitious of children, was a distant dream. Schooling was often reserved for children of wealth, and for the poor, even basic education was a luxury. Most children, even if they could attend the meager public schools available, were forced to leave at a young age to contribute to the family income. Boys worked in factories, while girls often found themselves in the sweatshops, their small hands moving quickly through the weaving machines. There was no room for dreams of upward mobility, and for many, the only escape from the relentless grind of labor was death. Diseases such as tuberculosis, cholera, and typhoid fever ran rampant through the slums, claiming the lives of many. Hospitals, if they existed at all, were few and overcrowded, offering no hope to those who fell ill. The poor had no access to proper medical care, and many died in the same squalor in which they had lived. The death toll was staggering, and yet life continued as a slow march through the muck of poverty. The sick lived side by side with the healthy, the young with the old, and the suffering with the living. In this environment, survival was a daily miracle, and death was just another part of life. Those who managed to find work were often exploited to the extreme. The factories that sprawled across London were nothing more than machines of human labor, where workers were subjected to long hours, poor working conditions, and low wages. The men, women, and children who worked in these factories toiled relentlessly, their bodies pushed to their limits, and their lives reduced to mere hours of labor. There was no respite, no day off, just the constant grind of industry that fed the vast empire, but left nothing but broken bodies and weary minds behind. For the poor, life in Victorian London was a cruel cycle of exploitation. While the wealthier classes dined on luxurious foods in their grand homes, the poor barely scraped by, often eating little more than stale bread or a meager portion of soup. The contrast between the two worlds was stark, yet the poor had little hope of breaking free from the cycle. There was no upward mobility, no safety net, and no opportunities to escape the harshness of their existence. For those who managed to survive, the future held little promise. There was no retirement, no rest for the weary. Instead, the poor were trapped in their roles as laborers, their lives dictated by the demands of the Industrial Revolution and the ever-growing city. They live in the shadows of the wealthy, invisible to those who walk the clean, paved streets, living lives that were filled with suffering, pain, and little hope of change. Yet, despite the brutality of their lives, the people of the slums continued to fight for survival. They had no choice but to endure, to make do with whatever they had, and to keep pushing forward day after day. In the face of such misery, there were small moments of joy, a shared laugh, a friendly gesture, a brief respite from the hard work. But they were fleeting, overshadowed by the relentless grind of existence. The people of the slums knew that their lives were a struggle, but they also knew that to stop fighting meant to surrender to the inevitable. And so they continued, carrying the weight of their world on their shoulders, hoping against hope that somehow, someday, things would be different. Part 2. As the morning fog lifted, the relentless noise of London's industrial heart began to take over. The clang of hammers, the hiss of steam, and the creaking of machinery filled the air, a soundtrack to the lives of the working poor who were already on their way to another grueling day. These people, whose very existence was entwined with the wheels of industry, had no other choice but to push forward, their bodies worn from the relentless cycle of labor. The men, women, and children of the slums were no strangers to exhaustion. By sunrise, the factories, docks, and mills were already alive with activity, and the workers were already clocking in. The men trudged to the factories, their faces blank, their eyes tired but steely. They wore their worn-out coats and hats, none of which offered any protection from the biting cold that had seeped into their bones. Their shoes, if they had them, were patched up, the soles barely holding together. The streets were filled with these silent figures, heads down, shoulders hunched, each one absorbed in the grim task of survival. The factory whistle would sound, signaling the beginning of another day that would last from dawn until dusk. For the men, the factory was both their livelihood and their prison. The air was thick with smoke, soot, and the deafening noise of the machines that powered the Industrial Revolution. The heat was stifling in the summer months, and the machines, relentless in their operations, seemed to mock the workers who toiled under their mechanical hands. The floors were slick with oil, and the workers often found themselves slipping, stumbling, and aching as they moved from one machine to the next. The smell of coal dust and hot metal filled their nostrils, making it difficult to breathe. Yet, despite the brutality of their work, the men had no choice but to keep moving. There was no relief, no respite from the factory floor, and no hope for something better. The wages they earned were barely enough to support their families, and the fear of losing their jobs was ever present. In the industrial world, the workers were nothing more than expendable cogs in a vast machine. The women, too, found themselves caught in the gears of industry, though their work was often just as physically demanding, if not more so. Many women worked in textile factories, where they operated looms, sewed clothes, or sorted fabric. Their hands were raw from handling the coarse textiles, and their backs were bent from hours of labor. Their clothes were equally as threadbare as those of their male counterparts, and they wore heavy aprons to shield themselves from the dirt and grease. The factory owners paid them far less than their male workers, and the hours were no more forgiving. Yet, for the women, this work was their only option. They had no other means of supporting themselves or their children. The women in the slums did not live with the luxury of choice. Every day, they fought to stay afloat in a world that seemed determined to drown them. The children, tragically, were not spared from the hardships of life in the slums. In fact, they were often the first to be sent into the factories. Their small, nimble fingers were perfect for the repetitive, detailed tasks that the machines required. Many children worked in coal mines, crawling through narrow shafts too small for adults. Others worked in the factories, sitting on low stools and tending to the looms or running errands for the factory bosses. These children were not allowed to play. They were forced to grow up far too quickly, their childhoods robbed from them by the constant need to contribute to the family's survival. The hours were long, and the pay was pitiful. Even when they were allowed to sleep, it was often on the cold, hard ground in a cramped, shared room with several other children. The work was grueling, and the physical toll it took on their young bodies was immense. Their lungs became coated with dust, their bodies were bent and bruised from heavy lifting, and their eyes were strained from hours of working in poor light. But the worst part was a sense of hopelessness that surrounded them. They knew that the work would never stop, and that there was little chance of ever escaping the cycle of poverty that had defined their lives. Many children died before they reached adulthood, victims of accidents in the mines or factories, or diseases that spread like wildfire through the unsanitary slums. Back at home, the conditions were no better. The overcrowded, ramshackle tenements offered little comfort, and the families who lived in them often shared one room, with a small stove for warmth and little more than a mattress on the floor. The walls were thin, the air stale, and the noise from the street never ceased. The families lived in constant fear of the landlord, who demanded rent that was often impossible to pay. Those who fell behind on payments risked being evicted, forced out into the streets with nothing but their meager belongings. The women, who worked all day in the factories, came home to take care of the children and manage the household. Their work was never done. They cooked whatever food they could afford, cleaned, and did laundry. If they were lucky, they might be able to buy some bread or soup to feed their families. But it was never enough. Malnutrition was rampant in the slums, and the diseases that plagued the area, such as cholera, tuberculosis, and smallpox, took a heavy toll. The death rate among the poor was staggeringly high, with children being the most vulnerable. The working poor in Victorian London lived in constant fear, not only of losing their jobs and homes, but of the sickness that might take their lives at any moment. Despite the suffering, the people of the slums did not give up. They held on to small moments of joy, gathering together for a brief respite from the work, sharing what little they had, and finding comfort in their families. But the harsh reality of their lives was never far away. The working poor in Victorian London lived in a world where survival was a daily battle, and where every day they fought to simply exist in a city that offered them nothing but hardship. Yet in their struggle, they found strength to keep going, even when everything seemed stacked against them. Theirs was a life of resilience, of endurance, of holding on to hope in the face of overwhelming adversity. But in the end, it was a relentless grind of life in the slums that would define their existence. Part 3. Queen Victoria's reign began at a time when the world was undergoing profound transformation, and her role in that transformation would be both emblematic and paradoxical. On one hand, she was the face of a vast empire, a symbol of the might and grandeur of British power. But on the other hand, her personal life was often marked by personal sorrow, emotional isolation, and profound sense of duty that shaped her actions and legacy. Victoria's early life was one of relative solitude and control. Born in 1819, she was the only child of the Duke of Kent and Princess Victoria of Saxe-Coburg-Saalfeld. From a young age, she was isolated from the wider political world. her upbringing controlled by her mother, who sought to maintain strict influence over her daughter's life. This overbearing maternal presence left Victoria with little sense of independence, and it was not until her father's death in 1820 and her subsequent accession to the throne at age 18 that she began to carve out her own identity. It was, however, a role thrust upon her, not one she chose. Victoria's ascension to the throne in 1837 was unexpected, as she was not the first in line. Yet, with the sudden death of her uncle, King William IV, the young Victoria was crowned Queen of the United Kingdom. The nation, and indeed the world, watched as this young, untested woman took the throne, while beneath her feet the tides of change in the empire, with its rising industrial power and vast colonial ambitions, were already gathering strength. Her first few years on the throne were filled with intense political maneuvering as she sought to navigate the complexities of royal life and her relationship with the political class. Despite her deep personal shyness and sense of responsibility, Victoria quickly became an effective monarch, even though much of the political power was still vested in her prime ministers. The real power lay with her ability to influence and shape public opinion. As a figurehead, she was revered by the British public, and her reign came to symbolize stability and strength, qualities that were deeply important to the nation, especially as it faced the challenges of industrialization. Victoria's personal life, however, was fraught with turmoil. Her marriage to Prince Albert of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, her cousin, was one of political necessity, but it grew into one of deep affection. Albert, a man of intellectual depth and discipline, was Victoria's closest confidant and advisor. Their union, though founded on a mutual respect, provided her with the emotional stability and partnership that her early years lacked. They had 9 children together, and despite the pressures of court life, they seemed to form a close-knit family unit. Albert's involvement in governmental affairs, including his encouragement of social reform and his efforts to improve working conditions, deeply influenced the policies of the British monarchy. But it was Albert's death in 1861 that sent Victoria into a prolonged state of mourning, forever altering the course of her reign. The loss of her beloved husband plunged her into grief, and she withdrew from public life for a time, wearing black for the rest of her days. Her mourning was seen by the public as excessive, and her absence from public duties left a void in the royal family's image. Yet, despite this personal tragedy, she continued to reign. Her grief, though genuine and deeply felt, became a part of the public narrative, and her emotional withdrawal reflected the pressures of living in the public eye. The public, for the most part, sympathized with their queen, but they also began to perceive her as a somewhat distant figure, a queen whose humanity showed in her sorrow, but who was still expected to carry on her duties as the emblem of the nation. Victoria's relationship with her empire was similarly complex. Under her reign, the British Empire expanded to its greatest territorial extent. The British Empire, by the late 19th century, controlled vast swathes of land across Africa, Asia, the Caribbean, and the Pacific. It was said that the sun never set on the British Empire, and yet, despite its global reach, Victoria never traveled beyond Europe. Her sense of empire was more abstract, often symbolized by the vast network of imperial politics and global trade that defined her reign. Her role in these affairs, while not one of direct governance, was still immensely influential. She embodied the ideals of British imperialism and colonial rule, even as those very ideals were beginning to face mounting criticism. Victoria's personal grief, combined with the ever-expanding responsibilities of the empire, marked the latter years of her reign. While she continued to be a figurehead, her role as monarch evolved. She became more symbolic and active in the governance of the empire, her influence primarily exercised through her relationships with her prime ministers and the growing parliamentary system. Her reign saw the rise of mass democracy, the growth of trade unions, and increasing calls for social reform, particularly in relation to the working class. Victoria's legacy is a complex one, defined as much by the expansion of British imperial power as by her personal sorrow. While she was seen as the embodiment of stability and the moral center of the British Empire, the reality of her reign was far more nuanced. She was not just a monarch, but a woman struggling to balance duty with personal loss, a ruler contending with the demands of a rapidly changing world, while still trying to maintain the ideals that had guided her throughout her reign. In her later years, Victoria came to represent the old order, stately, conservative, and removed from the world change that was sweeping across Britain. Her death in 1901 marked the end of the Victorian era, a period that had witnessed monumental shifts in society, technology, and global power. But also marked the end of an era for Victoria herself, whose personal life was as deeply tied to the identity of her reign as the empire was to her. Despite the challenges, her reign and her personal journey will forever be intertwined with the story of Victorian Britain, an era of imperial might, social division, and an evolving sense of national identity. Part 4. Queen Victoria's relationship with her family and her intense personal sorrow after the death of Prince Albert was a defining feature of her later years. After Albert's death in 1861, she withdrew even further from public life, and her grief overshadowed her duties as monarch. For the rest of her reign, she would wear mourning attire, black dresses, veils, and gloves, symbolizing her enduring love for the prince and her inability to move beyond her grief. Her intense mourning not only affected her, but it also reshaped the monarchy's public image, as it became intertwined with her personal sorrow and emotional withdrawal. In the years following Albert's death, Victoria's relationship with her children also became increasingly important. Her 9 children, whom she had raised in a tightly controlled and very structured environment, were sources of both pride and frustration. Her eldest son, the Prince of Wales, later Edward VII, had long been a source of tension for Victoria. His lifestyle, filled with excess scandals and a lack of interest in the duties of a prince, was a continual source of disapproval for Victoria. Their strained relationship grew more complex as the years passed, with Victoria viewing her son's behavior as a personal betrayal of the values she had worked so hard to instill in him. Despite the tensions, Victoria relied heavily on her family, especially her children, to help manage her emotional and political responsibilities. However, it was her relationship with Prince Arthur and Prince Leopold, 2 of her sons, that provided her with a sense of emotional connection after Albert's death. Prince Arthur, who had served in the military, became a quiet source of pride for Victoria, embodying the discipline and duty she valued so highly. Meanwhile, Prince Leopold, who suffered from hemophilia, held a special place in her heart due to his frailty and the care that he required. His untimely death at the age of 30 in 1884 left another profound mark on her heart. The series of personal losses, including the death of Albert and then Leopold, further solidified Victoria's withdrawal into her private mourning world, while also highlighting the delicate balance she had to maintain between public duty and personal grief. Despite her personal sorrow, Queen Victoria remained a symbol of the British Empire and its strength, even as the empire itself faced increasing challenges. By the time she reached her later years, the global landscape had shifted dramatically. The Industrial Revolution had transformed Britain, giving rise to a new industrial middle class, while the wealth generated by British colonies across the world had deepened the divides between rich and poor. Social movements were gaining momentum, with demands for better working conditions, voting rights, and social reforms sweeping across Britain. The working class, long oppressed and forgotten, was beginning to assert itself, and their demands for justice were becoming impossible for the monarchy to ignore. In her final years, Victoria struggled to reconcile her personal grief with the demands of her role as the head of state. She was more distant from the day-to-day affairs of her government, and the prime ministers and government ministers who served her had greater control over British affairs. The monarchy, once the pinnacle of political power, had become more symbolic in the wake of Britain's growing democracy. The Queen's role shifted from one of active governance to that of a figurehead, a symbol of continuity for the British Empire. Her relationship with her prime ministers, especially Disraeli and Gladstone, was often marked by a cordial but formal distance. Disraeli, in particular, played an important role in maintaining Victoria's influence, and their mutual admiration was one of the few sources of joy and stimulation in her later years. In 1897, Victoria celebrated her Diamond Jubilee, marking 60 years on the throne. The event was a monumental one, highlighting both the grandeur of her reign and the vastness of the British Empire. However, it was also a bittersweet occasion, as Victoria, by then in her late 70s, was frail and weary. Her physical health was rapidly declining, and the toll of decades of grief, coupled with the pressure of ruling an empire, had begun to take its toll. Yet, despite her declining health, she continued to serve as a symbol of strength for her people, with her Diamond Jubilee marking the height of her status as an imperial monarch. By the time of her death in 1901, Queen Victoria had reigned for over 63 years, making her the longest reigning monarch in British history at the time. She passed away at Osborne House on the Isle of Wight, surrounded by her family. Her death marked the end of an era, the Victorian era, a period defined by the expansion of the British Empire, the rise of industrial power, and significant social and cultural shifts. It also marked the end of the personal legacy of a monarch who had struggled between the weight of imperial expectations and her own profound emotional turmoil. Victoria's death was met with national mourning. Her passing symbolized the end of the Victorian age and the beginning of the Edwardian era, ushered in by her son, Edward VII. While her reign had seen both imperial grandeur and personal sorrow, Queen Victoria remained a pivotal figure in British history, shaping the monarchy and her empire for generations to come. Her legacy, however, was far more complicated than that of a mere monarch. She was a mother, a widow, and a queen whose life was defined by both personal and national struggles. Through the years of sorrow and triumph, Queen Victoria had become much more than a monarch. She had become an emblem of both the strength and vulnerability of the British Empire. Her reign had set the tone for a time of great change, and her influence, both as a ruler and a mother, would continue to resonate long after her death. Yet, the legacy she left behind was one of profound complexity, a queen who struggled with immense personal grief while presiding over an empire that shaped the modern world. Part 5. While the working poor toiled under the oppressive conditions of Victorian London, the upper class lived in a world of wealth, privilege, and relative comfort, isolated from the hardships that plagued the lives of the working masses. This stark contrast between the lives of the wealthy and the destitute was a defining feature of the Victorian era, and it underscored the deep social divisions that characterized the time. The homes of the upper class were palatial, reflecting the grandeur of their position in society. They lived in stately mansions, often located in the affluent areas of London, away from the dirty, congested streets of slums. The architecture of these homes was ornate, with high ceilings, gilded moldings, and sweeping staircases that seemed to rise to infinity. Each room was meticulously designed to impress, decorated with expensive furniture, fine art, and intricate rugs. The floors were often made of polished hardwood, and the walls were covered with sumptuous wallpaper or adorned with tapestries depicting historical scenes or nature's beauty. Expensive chandeliers lit these rooms with a warm, golden glow, while the soft scent of freshly cut flowers filled the air. In these opulent homes, the aristocracy lived in relative comfort, free from the constant battle for survival that defined the lives of the working poor. They dressed in the finest garments, made from silks, velvets, and other luxurious fabrics. The women of the upper class wore elaborate gowns that flowed to the floor, their bodies cinched by tightly laced corsets to achieve a desired hourglass figure. Their gowns were often adorned with lace, ribbons, and embroidery, and they wore jewelry made from diamonds, pearls, and gold. Men, on the other hand, wore tailored suits, often consisting of waistcoats, frock coats, and trousers, with cravat or tie neatly arranged at their necks. Top hats completed the look, and their polished boots shone brightly, a testament to their wealth and status. Social events were an integral part of the upper-class lifestyle. They hosted grand balls, lavish dinners, and exclusive gatherings, all designed to maintain their social standing and strengthen their influence. These events were not only about pleasure and entertainment, but also about networking and reinforcing one's position in the complex social hierarchy. The guests who attended these affairs were not merely there for the food and music. They were there to assert their dominance and prestige, ensuring their continued relevance in society. At these gatherings, the women of the aristocracy played a central role. They were expected to be graceful, charming, and well-educated in the arts of conversation, dance, and etiquette. They were trained to be the ideal hostesses, maintaining the social atmosphere with poise and tact. Women were also expected to manage the household, overseeing the servants who maintained the estate. It was a demanding and unglamorous role, though it was rarely acknowledged publicly. Behind the scenes, however, the women of the upper class often faced their own set of struggles. While they may have appeared to lead lives of luxury, they were not free to pursue personal ambitions or careers. Their primary role was to marry well, produce heirs, and support their husbands in maintaining the family status. Love was not always a factor in these marriages. Instead, strategic unions were made to secure wealth, property, and social position. The women had little agency over their own futures, often seen as mere tools in the maintenance of the family's legacy. For the men of the upper class, life was similarly governed by expectations. While they were free to engage in various political and social endeavors, their primary responsibility was to ensure the continued prosperity of the family. This meant managing estates, overseeing businesses, or holding positions in government. Many aristocrats were also active in the military, where they could prove their courage and honor in battle. The pressure to uphold the family name and tradition often weighed heavily on these men, leaving little room for personal desires or freedom. Yet, despite the outward appearances of control and stability, the upper class in Victorian London was far from immune to personal tragedies and challenges. Beneath the surface of wealth and refinement, the aristocracy also faced pressures that were often hidden from the public eye. The constant maintenance of appearances, the fear of scandal, and the need to keep up with the changing tides of politics and society created an undercurrent of anxiety among the wealthy. One of the most significant challenges for the upper class was the rise of the industrial and working classes, which threatened to upend the social order. The Industrial Revolution had given birth to a new class of wealthy entrepreneurs and factory owners, many of whom had started with little more than a small business and a desire to succeed. These newly rich individuals sought to join the ranks of the aristocracy, purchasing estates, building mansions, and establishing themselves as powerful figures in society. This threatened the traditional dominance of the old landed gentry, leading to tensions and competition within the upper echelons of society. Additionally, the rise of political reform movements, which demanded greater rights for the working class, began to challenge the authority of the aristocracy. The middle class, which was rapidly growing in number and influence, pushed for reforms that would allow them greater representation in government and better working conditions for the laboring masses. The aristocracy, in turn, found itself increasingly challenged by the rising tide of change, unsure how to maintain its status in a world that was becoming more democratic and industrialized. Despite these pressures, the aristocracy continued to live lives of immense privilege, insulated from the daily struggles of the working poor. They were able to enjoy the fruits of empire, indulging in lavish travels, attending theater performances, and patronizing the arts. The finest artists, musicians, and writers were often commissioned to produce works that reflected the values and tastes of the upper class, further cementing their position at the top of society. However, as the 19th century came to a close, the foundations of the Victorian upper class began to show signs of cracking. The rise of social movements, coupled with the growing influence of the middle class, began to challenge the power of the aristocracy. The opulence and luxury that had once been seen as a birthright were increasingly questioned as the new social order sought greater equity and opportunity for all, not just the privileged few. Thus, while the upper class in Victorian London enjoyed wealth and comfort, their lives were not without their own set of challenges. They lived within a social system that demanded they uphold traditions and maintain their status, all while facing the increasing threat of political and social change. Their lives were defined by a delicate balance of power, prestige, and public image, and while they were able to avoid the squalor and suffering of the slums, they too were trapped in a world that demanded more than they could ever provide. Segment 3. The Mystery of Jack the Ripper. Part 1. The fog rolled in from the River Thames, thick and suffocating, cloaking the alleyways of Whitechapel in a shroud of darkness. It was a perfect cover for a killer who struck fear into the hearts of the working poor who populated these narrow, squalid streets. The atmosphere in Whitechapel was heavy, not just from the usual smells of sewage and coal smoke, but from the palpable terror that gripped the neighborhood. Whispers of a murderer who stalked the streets at night had spread like wildfire through the tight-knit community. They spoke in hushed tones, fearful of who might be next. It began in the early hours of August 31st, 1888, with the brutal murder of Mary Ann Nichols, a 43-year-old prostitute. She was found in Bucks Row, her body horrifically mutilated. Her throat had been slashed and her abdomen torn open, the violence of the act leaving little to the imagination. The police were called to the scene, but the killer was already gone, vanishing into the fog like a shadow. The crime scene was eerily calm, save for the gruesome nature of the attack. At the time, it seemed an isolated incident, but soon more women would meet the same fate. The killer, later dubbed Jack the Ripper, was not just a murderer, but a symbol of the unseen horrors that lay beneath the polished surface of Victorian society. For the poor of Whitechapel, life was already filled with suffering. The streets were overcrowded, disease ran rampant, and work was scarce. Yet, it was the murder of these women, poor, vulnerable, and marginalized, that made the case so chilling. The Ripper's victims were prostitutes, women who lived on the fringes of society, ignored and exploited by the system. In a city that had no qualms about turning a blind eye to the suffering of the poor, these deaths seemed even more grotesque. As the days passed, more women were discovered brutally murdered, each crime more savage than the last. Annie Chapman was the second victim, found on September 8th, just a week after Nichols. Her body was discovered in a small yard behind 29 Hanbury Street, her throat slashed and her body mutilated in a similar fashion to the first. The mutilations were precise, suggesting the killer had some knowledge of anatomy. As the murders continued, the police, unable to make any significant progress, became desperate for leads. Rumors and theories flooded the streets of Whitechapel, each one more bizarre than the last. Was the killer a surgeon, a butcher, or perhaps someone with medical training? The nature of the killing suggested a certain expertise, yet no one could agree on who the killer might be. The third victim, Elizabeth Stride, was found on September 30th in Dutfield's yard. Her throat was slashed, but she had not been mutilated in the same way as the others. Some investigators believe that the killer had been interrupted during his attack, while others suggested that Stride's murder might have been a different crime altogether. Regardless, the fear and tension in Whitechapel reached new heights, and many women, prostitutes or not, began to avoid the streets after dark, fearing they too might become the next victim. But it was the fourth murder, that of Catherine Eddowes, found in Mitre Square on the same night as Stride, that made the connection between the murders undeniable. Eddowes was mutilated in the same grotesque manner as the previous victims, her organs removed with surgical precision. The sight of her body, left in the public square, sent shockwaves through the community and the police. The Ripper had escalated his violence and now seemed to be taunting both the authorities and the public, as if daring them to catch him. With the murders stacking up, the public's fear grew more intense and rumors swirled. Some believed the killer was a madman, others thought it was someone seeking revenge, and a few suspected it was a member of the upper class, hiding behind a mask of respectability. The police, meanwhile, were no closer to identifying the killer. The investigation was a maze of misdirections, false leads, and a growing sense of frustration. The press played a significant role in the case, feeding the public's obsession with the mystery of the Ripper. Newspapers published sensationalized accounts of the murders, detailing the brutal nature of the killings and speculating on the identity of the killer. Some even published letters that were purportedly written by the Ripper himself, adding to the terror and intrigue. One such letter, known as the Dear Boss letter, taunted the police and claimed responsibility for the murders, using crude language and boasting of the killer's ability to elude capture. It became one of the most famous pieces of the Ripper mystery, though its authenticity has always been debated. The police, under immense pressure from the public and the media, attempted every possible strategy to catch the killer. They scoured the slums, interviewing witnesses, gathering evidence, and issuing public warnings. They even resorted to placing advertisements in the newspapers, urging the public to be vigilant and report any suspicious activity. But no one could identify the murderer, and as the weeks turned into months, the murders ceased. Jack the Ripper, it seemed, had disappeared into the shadows, leaving behind only the brutal remnants of his crimes and a city gripped by fear. The mystery of Jack the Ripper remains unsolved to this day. Despite numerous theories, investigations, and modern forensic analysis, the identity of the killer has never been definitively established. Was he a doctor, a butcher, or a deranged madman? Did he come from the ranks of the poor, or was he someone cloaked in wealth and respectability, using his status to escape suspicion? Theories abound, but no answers have come. What remains is the legend of Jack the Ripper, a chilling reminder of the horrors that can exist in the darkest corners of society. The legacy of the Ripper is also one of tragedy and injustice. His victims, the women of Whitechapel, were the most vulnerable members of society, poor, neglected, and discarded. Their lives, though overshadowed by the horror of their deaths, highlight the systemic inequality of Victorian London, where the suffering of the poor was largely ignored, and where even their deaths were treated with the same disregard. The story of Jack the Ripper is not just the story of a brutal killer. It is also the story of society that failed its most vulnerable, allowing them to fall prey to both crime and neglect. As Whitechapel streets settled into uneasy quiet, the fear of Jack the Ripper lingered, and for the people who lived in the shadows of London's wealth and grandeur, the memories of that terror would never fade. Part 2. As the murders continued, the public and the police became increasingly consumed by the mystery of Jack the Ripper. The killer's ability to elude capture, despite the mounting resources and efforts of the police, fueled the fear and obsession surrounding the case. The streets of Whitechapel were haunted by whispers, and the air was thick with speculation, rumors, and accusations. The working poor, who had long been vulnerable to the harsh realities of life in Victorian London, now had to contend with a predator stalking their midst, seemingly invisible, yet lurking just beyond the edge of their world. The police, overwhelmed and underprepared for the scale of the investigation, found themselves trapped in a web of confusion. The Ripper's crimes seemed random, but they also displayed a methodical precision that suggested the killer had some understanding of human anatomy, fueling speculation that he might be a doctor, surgeon, or someone with medical training. Each victim was mutilated in a similar fashion, with slashed throats and disemboweled bodies. But what was even more unsettling was a pattern. Each murder was committed in the dead of night, in quiet, isolated locations where the killer knew he would be left undisturbed. The lack of witnesses, coupled with the anonymity of Whitechapel's dark, narrow streets, made it nearly impossible for police to track down any leads. To make matters worse, a chilling series of letters surfaced, allegedly written by the killer himself, further heightening the terror and mystery. These letters, often filled with taunts and crude language, painted a terrifying portrait of a man both confident and malicious in his ability to escape detection. One letter, known as the From Hell letter, arrived with a piece of human kidney, which the sender claimed to have taken from one of the victims. This letter, like the others, was filled with grotesque references to the murders and implied a disturbing satisfaction from the killer's actions. Some believed these letters to be the work of a copycat or a hoaxer, but others, particularly the public and the press, latched onto them as clues that would eventually lead to the killer's identification. Despite the mounting pressure and the media frenzy surrounding the murders, the police remained largely unsuccessful in uncovering the Ripper's identity. There were countless theories. Some suggested the killer was a member of the upper class, perhaps even a doctor or a person of influence, using his position to evade suspicion. Others proposed that the murderer was someone with a personal vendetta, targeting these women as an act of revenge or hatred. Speculation about the killer's identity ran wild, but no solid evidence ever emerged to pinpoint the Ripper's true identity. The idea that the Ripper could be a member of the elite was especially troubling to many. The notion that a man of higher social standing could slip undetected through the squalor of Whitechapel seemed to expose a flaw in the system, a dangerous reminder that even the most privileged could hide behind masks of respectability. This theory added a layer of class-based fear to the growing sense of terror, as it implied that no one was truly safe, not even the most powerful members of society. By the end of 1888, the killings ceased, and Jack the Ripper seemed to vanish into the mists of London. The police, who had thrown all their resources into the investigation, were left with little to show for their efforts. The Ripper had outwitted them, leaving behind nothing but a string of brutal murders and a city gripped by fear. The press, hungry for sensational stories, seized on the mystery, but as the years passed, public interest began to wane. Whitechapel returned to its grim existence, but the memory of the murders and the name Jack the Ripper would linger long after the killing stopped. Despite the end of the murders, the legacy of Jack the Ripper remained. The case became an emblem of both the vulnerability and the resilience of the poor in Victorian London. For the women of Whitechapel, whose lives were often disregarded by society, the Ripper's attacks were a brutal reminder of the dangers they faced daily, dangers that were not only physical but social and economic. They were women who lived on the fringes of society, with few rights and fewer protections. And the murders revealed just how expendable they were in the eyes of the public. The mystery of the Ripper also highlighted the deep divisions within Victorian society. The working-class residents of Whitechapel, already living under harsh conditions, now had to contend with a predator among them. Yet, their plight was often ignored, and the social systems that allowed such poverty to fester remained largely unchanged. While the rich and powerful were sheltered from the realities of life in the slums, the poor continued to suffer, their voices drowned out by the more privileged classes. The case of Jack the Ripper became a symbol of both the anonymity of crime and the failure of the state to protect the most vulnerable. It exposed the darkness that lay just beneath the surface of Victorian respectability and illuminated the dangers lurking in the shadows of the city. The Ripper's identity may never have been uncovered, but the fear and fascination surrounding the case would endure. For decades to come, Jack the Ripper will remain an enigma, a monster who haunted the streets of London, and whose true identity might never be known. Yet, the legacy of his crimes will continue to resonate, a reminder of the fragility of life, especially for those who live in the margins of society. Today, the story of Jack the Ripper is more than just a true crime mystery. It is a lens through which we can examine the darker aspects of Victorian society, its class inequalities, its treatment of women, and the deep divides between the rich and the poor. The mystery of the Ripper, unresolved though it may be, offers us a glimpse into a world where fear, social neglect, and brutal violence shape the lives of many, leaving behind a legacy that endures in collective imagination. Part 3. As the years passed and the murder stopped, Jack the Ripper's name continued to echo through the annals of history, becoming synonymous with terror and mystery. His crimes, though they ended as abruptly as they had begun, left an indelible mark on Victorian society, and the fear and fascination surrounding them would never truly fade. The mystery of his identity remained unsolved, and in the absence of answers, speculation ran rampant. With no definitive leads, the case of Jack the Ripper became one of the most infamous unsolved mysteries in criminal history, a riddle that would haunt London for generations. The public's obsession with the case only deepened over time. The gruesome nature of the murders, the lack of solid evidence, and the taunting letters that seemed to come from the killer himself created a chilling narrative that was too compelling to ignore. People wanted answers, but those answers never came. Was Jack the Ripper still alive? Had he moved on to other places, continuing his reign of terror in secret? Or had he simply disappeared, as mysteriously as he had arrived? Over time, the case faded from the front pages of the newspapers, but Jack the Ripper's legend grew. The idea of the elusive killer, still out there in the shadows, intrigued people across the world. He became the subject of books, films, and television shows, his name woven into the fabric of criminal lore. The story of his killing, sensationalized, exaggerated, and twisted, captured the imagination of the public, becoming not just a story of a murderer, but a symbol of fear, social neglect, and the dangers lurking beneath the surface of society. Historians, criminologists, and amateur sleuths alike have spent decades attempting to solve the Ripper mystery. Over the years, countless theories about his identity have emerged, each more elaborate than the last. Some suggest that the killer was a doctor or a butcher, trained in the ways of anatomy and surgery. Others believe he could have been a member of the royal family, an eccentric prince who used his status to escape suspicion. Some have even speculated that the killer was a woman, an idea that continues to spark debates to this day. Among the most widely debated suspects is Montague John Druitt, a barrister and teacher who committed suicide shortly after the murder stopped. Some believe his death marked the end of the Ripper killings, but the lack of concrete evidence linking him to the crimes has kept his involvement in question. Another popular suspect is Aaron Kosminski, a Jewish immigrant who was known to have had mental health issues and was reportedly seen near the crime scenes. Some police officials at the time believed Kosminski was a killer, but again, there was no definitive proof, and the case against him remained speculative at best. Yet, despite the numerous theories and suspects, the case remains frustratingly elusive. No single theory has managed to definitively explain who Jack the Ripper was or why he committed his heinous acts. The lack of conclusive evidence, combined with the passage of time, has made it increasingly difficult to separate fact from myth. The killer's true identity, if it ever comes to light, may remain a mystery forever. For the people of Whitechapel, however, the scars of the Ripper's reign of terror never fully healed. Though the murders ceased, the legacy of fear and suspicion lingered in the streets. The people of Whitechapel, already living in poverty and squalor, had to endure the added burden of knowing that one of their own, or at least someone who moved through their world, had been capable of such brutality. The killer's ability to slip through the cracks of a rapidly industrializing society, evading the authorities at every turn, only served to highlight the deep divisions in Victorian society. The poor were often invisible to the powers that be, their suffering unnoticed until it became something too horrifying to ignore. The murders of Jack the Ripper brought attention to the social injustices that permeated Victorian society, particularly the treatment of women. The victims of the Ripper were all prostitutes, women who were already marginalized and neglected by society. Their deaths were a brutal reminder of how little value society placed on the lives of the poor, especially women who lived on the fringes. In a society obsessed with respectability and propriety, the women of Whitechapel were seen as expendable, their lives disposable. The Ripper's killings, though horrific, also served as a stark reflection of the brutal realities faced by these women, whose lives were often reduced to their sexual worth and nothing more. In the years that followed the murders, there were calls for social reform, including better working conditions of the poor, more effective policing in the slums, and greater protections for women. However, the changes that followed were slow and insufficient. The conditions in Whitechapel remained dire for many years, and it would take decades before any significant improvements were made. The legacy of the Ripper's crimes became intertwined with the growing social movements of the time, highlighting the need for reform in the treatment of the working class and women. Today, the story of Jack the Ripper endures as both a historical mystery and a symbol of the harsh realities of Victorian life. His identity may remain a mystery, but the fear and fascination he created are as relevant today as they were more than a century ago. The case continues to capture the public imagination, not only because of its gruesome nature, but because it speaks to deeper issues of class, gender, and the failure of the social system to protect its most vulnerable. The figure of Jack the Ripper has evolved beyond that of a mere murderer. He is now a symbol of the dark underbelly of Victorian society, a reflection of the fears and tensions that ran through the streets of London. His murders, though terrifying, are a lens through which we can examine the inequalities and struggles faced by the poor, especially women, in one of the most powerful empires the world has ever known. The mystery of Jack the Ripper, unsolved though it may be, remains an important part of our collective history, a reminder of the fragility of life in a world where darkness can sometimes hide in plain sight. Part 4. Despite the passage of time and the evolution of forensic methods, the mystery of Jack the Ripper has endured as one of the most captivating and chilling true crime cases in history. The murderer's identity remains unknown, and the Ripper's legacy is a haunting reminder of the deep-seated social inequalities and fears that permeated Victorian London. The unsolved nature of the case has ensured that Jack the Ripper's name continues to stir up intrigue, prompting countless theories, investigations, and speculations that have kept the case alive in public consciousness for over a century. The fact that Jack the Ripper's identity remains elusive speaks to the failure of both the police and society at large to confront the very real and systemic issues that allowed such a killer to thrive. The environment of Whitechapel, where the murders took place, was one of extreme poverty and neglect. The streets were filled with destitution, disease, and crime. The victims of the Ripper were prostitutes, the most vulnerable members of society, who lived on the margins and were often ignored by the authorities. The women who became the Ripper's victims were not just killed, they were discarded, their lives deemed of little consequence. This grim reality casts a shadow over the investigation, revealing how society often overlooks the most disenfranchised, even in the face of violence. For the police in 1888, the case was an overwhelming challenge. They had little to no physical evidence to work with, and a lack of reliable witnesses made it nearly impossible to build a case. The public's increasing obsession with the case only added pressure to an already tense situation, and the police were criticized for their inability to apprehend the killer. In hindsight, many believe that the police were dealing with a highly skilled and organized individual, someone who understood how to evade capture. Jack the Ripper's ability to move through the foggy streets of Whitechapel undetected, vanishing before anyone could stop him, fueled a growing sense of fear and helplessness in the public. Compounding the difficulty of the investigation was the political and social climate of the time. Whitechapel was a hotbed of social unrest, with increasing political radicalization among the working class and rising concerns about crime and poverty. The working poor were beginning to demand better living conditions, and their growing discontent with the status quo created an atmosphere of distrust between the lower classes and the authorities. The police, often seen as the enforcers of an unjust system, struggled to gain cooperation from a population that viewed them with suspicion. The investigation into the Ripper's crimes, like many other law enforcement efforts at the time, was hampered by class divides and the reluctance of witnesses to speak up only deepened the divide between the authorities and the people they were meant to protect. Theories about the Ripper's identity have flourished over the years, each one attempting to piece together the small amount of evidence that remains. Some suspect that the killer was a medical professional, either a doctor, a surgeon, or someone with surgical knowledge, due to the precise and deliberate nature of the mutilations. Others suggest that the killer may have been someone with a deep-seated grudge against women, someone who saw these murders as an expression of rage or retribution. Another theory posits that the Ripper was not a single individual, but perhaps a group of people, with the murders being part of a larger conspiracy. These ideas, though intriguing, remain speculative, and none have been definitively proven. One of the most persistent and controversial theories is the idea that Jack the Ripper may have been a member of the British royal family. The theory emerged in the late 19th century and gained traction in the years following the murders. Proponents of this theory suggest that the royal family, or more specifically, Prince Albert Victor, the Duke of Clarence, may have been involved in the killings. Some claim that the prince had been involved with the women of Whitechapel, and that the murders were part of a larger cover-up. While this theory has never been substantiated with evidence, it continues to capture the imagination of many and has become a popular topic in books and films. Another suspect, who has become a focal point in modern investigations, is Aaron Kosminski, a Polish immigrant and a barber who lived in Whitechapel. He was known to have had a history of mental illness and was reportedly seen near the crime scenes. In recent years, DNA testing has been used to examine evidence from the Ripper case, and Kosminski's name has resurfaced as a potential suspect. However, this theory remains contentious, and the evidence connecting Kosminski to the murders is far from conclusive. The lack of definitive proof continues to make the question of the Ripper's identity an unsolved riddle. Despite the many theories and the continued fascination with the case, the identity of Jack the Ripper remains one of the greatest unsolved mysteries in criminal history. The murderer's disappearance, just as suddenly as the killings had begun, has left us with more questions and answers. It is likely that we will never know who Jack the Ripper was, or why he committed such brutal and senseless acts of violence. But the enduring legacy of his crimes lies not only in the terror he inspired, but also in the way his murders brought to light the deep social and economic inequalities of Victorian London. The Ripper's murders, though horrific, expose the dark underbelly of the Victorian era. They revealed a society in which the poor, particularly women, were neglected, discarded, and ultimately victimized by a system that valued them least. The murders became a symbol of the failure of social reform and the brutal realities faced by those living in poverty. Jack the Ripper's legacy is intertwined with the history of London's slums, where inequality, crime, and violence were part of everyday life for the working poor. Though the mystery of Jack the Ripper may never be solved, his story continues to serve as a reminder of the need for greater social justice, empathy, and reform. His legacy has endured, not just as a criminal enigma, but as a symbol of fractured society, one in which the most vulnerable were left to suffer, while the powerful remained hidden behind the walls of privilege and respectability. Segment 4, Life in the Victorian Upper Class. Part 1. While the working poor in Victorian London battled daily for survival in the shadows of the city's industrial expansion, the upper class reveled in their wealth, privilege, and comfort. For the elite, life was a spectacle of luxury and status, a world removed from the squalor of the slums, where social conventions, tradition, and the desire for prestige defined every aspect of existence. The upper class in Victorian England lived a life marked by grandiosity and ritual, ensuring that they maintained their dominance over society, not just in terms of wealth, but in cultural and political influence as well. The homes of the wealthy were a reflection of both their social standing and their desire for comfort, extravagance, and distinction. These homes were often enormous mansions or sprawling estates, each meticulously maintained and filled with the finest furnishings money could buy. The architecture of these homes was ornate and designed to impress, with grand facade of stone or brick, towering windows, and beautifully landscaped gardens. The interiors were a celebration of wealth, with drawing rooms, libraries, and dining halls decked out in velvet, silk, and mahogany. The walls were adorned with priceless art, and the floors covered with plush carpets and imported rugs. The lighting was lavish, often in the form of intricate chandeliers, casting a golden glow on everything in the room. Each room in these grand homes served a specific purpose, from the private study to the music room, where the upper class could entertain guests or retreat for personal moments of reflection. The servants' quarters, hidden from view and tucked away in the upper levels or outbuildings, revealed the invisible workforce that kept the homes running. For the aristocrats, the use of servants was a sign of their status. Hundreds of staff members could be employed to manage every facet of the household, from cooking and cleaning to serving meals and tending the gardens. But the lives of the servants were vastly different from those of their employers. They worked long hours, often under harsh conditions, but their work was largely invisible to the family. Servants were expected to maintain the facade of order and refinement, but they themselves were seen as little more than extensions of the household machinery. The daily routine of the upper class was one of carefully crafted leisure and productivity, designed to maintain their position in society, while also providing the appearance of grace and dignity. The wealthy aristocrats had little concern for the menial tasks of daily survival, their time filled with social engagements, political affairs, and cultural pursuits. Breakfast was a leisurely affair, followed by a day of activities that could include hunting, riding, or attending to business matters, such as managing estates or overseeing the family's investments. For the women, however, life was far more circumscribed. They were expected to maintain a flawless appearance and oversee the smooth operation of their homes, including the hiring and management of staff. Their days were filled with needlework, playing musical instruments, and receiving guests. They were also expected to be well-versed in matters of etiquette and conversation, their roles as wives and mothers central to the stability of the family unit, while the men had more freedom to engage with public life. Whether through politics, business, or the military, the lives of women were defined by the domestic sphere. Marriage was often a strategic affair, a union that strengthened family connections, secured financial stability, or solidified political power. Love, while not completely absent from these marriages, was often secondary to these considerations. The social duty of women in the upper class was to marry well, raise children, and support their husbands in their social and political endeavors. A woman's worth was often tied to her ability to perform these duties with grace and efficiency, maintaining the family's reputation while contributing to the broader social fabric. The formalized nature of Victorian society extended far beyond the home and into the world of public events. Social gatherings, ranging from intimate dinners to grand balls, were essential components of life in the upper class. These events were not only a way to enjoy entertainment, but also a means of reinforcing one's social status. For the wealthy, hosting such events was a way of demonstrating their cultural sophistication and generosity. Balls and dinner parties were elaborate affairs, requiring careful attention to detail. Invitations were highly coveted, and the guest list often consisted of the most influential figures in society: politicians, businessmen, artists, and intellectuals. These gatherings were opportunities to secure new business deals, form political alliances, or simply display one's wealth and refinement to the wider community. Dress was a crucial aspect of these social events, with elaborate, meticulously designed outfits meant to impress. Women wore lavish gowns of silk, satin, or velvet, often adorned with lace, ribbons, and intricate beadwork. They were expected to wear their finest jewelry, such as diamonds, pearls, and cameos, and to maintain a delicate, poised appearance. Their hair was styled in elaborate updos, with curls and ringlets arranged with precision. Men, too, dressed for the occasion, wearing formal coats, waistcoat, and trousers, often accessorized with cravats, pocket watches, and top hats. It was all part of the performative aspect of their lives, an outward display of their wealth and social position. For all their wealth and apparent leisure, however, the upper class was not without its own struggles. Beneath the glittering surface of Victorian high society, pressures of a different nature existed. Many aristocratic families, despite their outward appearances, faced financial challenges. The upkeep of vast estates, the costs associated with maintaining social status, and the extravagant lifestyles they lay could strain even the wealthiest families. Some were forced to sell parts of their land or property to maintain their lifestyle, and the fear of financial ruin was a constant concern. In some cases, younger sons of aristocratic families, who would not inherit the family estate, were often sent into military or clergy, seeking a career outside the family home to secure their own futures. Yet, despite these pressures, the upper class remained largely insulated from the realities of life outside their walls. The problems of the working poor, the rising social unrest, and the increasing demands for political reform hardly touched their world. They were, in many ways, removed from the social upheaval of the time, content to continue with their established way of life. It was a life of comfort, luxury, and tradition, a life that was becoming increasingly untenable as the world around them began to change. The Industrial Revolution, the growth of the working class, and the call for democratic reforms all pointed to a shift in the balance of power, and the aristocracy was beginning to feel the effects of this transition, even if they were reluctant to acknowledge it. The Victorian upper class, while seemingly secure in their wealth and position, were facing the dawning of an era that would challenge the very foundations of their lifestyle. The world was changing, and the social structures that had supported the aristocracy for centuries were beginning to show signs of strain. Yet, for the time being, they continued to live in a bubble of privilege, separate from the struggles and hardships faced by the lower classes, insulated from the harsh realities that defined the lives of the working poor. But change was on the horizon, and the old social order was not destined to last forever. Part 2. While the upper class enjoyed a life of luxury and privilege, The reality beneath the surface was more complex and often fraught with unspoken pressures and challenges. The stability that their wealth and status provided was not without its cracks. Beneath the grand facades of their mansions and the elegant gowns of their soirees lay a society grappling with shifting dynamics, societal expectations, and the ever-looming presence of change. The roles and expectations placed on the men and women of the Victorian upper class were rigidly defined, and failure to live up to these ideals could result in social disgrace. For the men, the pressures were often related to maintaining the family legacy and wealth. As heads of the household, they were responsible for managing the family estate, making strategic business decisions, and ensuring that their wealth was preserved and grown. The survival of their families depended on their ability to navigate the complex world of investments, politics, and industry. They had to appear calm and collected, and control their fortune and reputation, all while facing the growing influence of the industrial middle class and the rising economic power of trade and business ventures. As land ownership became less profitable, many aristocratic families turned to other means of securing wealth, including investments in railways, mines, and factories. The newly rich middle class, often self-made men who had achieved great wealth through industry, were gaining power, creating a tension between the traditional aristocracy and this emerging group. In the political realm, the upper-class men held positions of authority, with many serving in the British Parliament or taking on roles in the military or legal system. Their influence shaped national policy, particularly in maintaining the status quo, which benefited them greatly. While they held considerable power, the shifting political landscape in the late 19th century, marked by the rise of political parties focused on representing the working class and the growing demand for democratic reforms, created uncertainty. The aristocracy was challenged not only by the new wealth of the middle class, but also by the voice of the people, whose calls for reforms, including the right to vote and improved working conditions, became more prominent. Women in the Victorian upper class faced a different, but equally stringent set of expectations. They were often regarded as the moral center of the household, responsible for upholding the family's social standing through their behavior, appearance, and involvement in social and charitable events. Marriage for women was a strategic matter, one that was often orchestrated by the family to strengthen alliances, consolidate wealth, or elevate status. Love, while not entirely absent, was secondary to these more practical considerations. In fact, the concept of romantic love as a foundation of marriage was still a relatively modern idea, and many upper-class women entered marriages as much out of duty as desire. Once married, women's lives became centered around the home. They were expected to oversee the domestic sphere, from managing household staff to ensuring that their children were properly raised. Education for women was largely limited to the domestic arts, the study of literature, and accomplishments such as painting, music, or needlework. A well-rounded lady was one who could entertain guests with grace, be knowledgeable about current events, and manage a household without faltering. However, this role was not as liberating as it might seem. Women were effectively confined to their homes, dependent on their husbands for financial support, and given little opportunity for intellectual or professional advancement. The birth of children, particularly sons, was one of the primary duties of a Victorian wife. The aristocracy was obsessed with lineage, and securing the family's future through male heirs was vital. In an era when inheritance laws were rigid, the family's wealth would pass down to the eldest son. As a result, the pressure on women to bear sons was intense, with the weight of family legacy often resting on their shoulders. Women were expected to be ideal mothers, cultivating children who would carry on the family's traditions and values, while also navigating the complex politics of social gatherings, where status was dictated by who one was seen with and how well one performed in society. Yet even in these carefully constructed lives, women faced deep internal struggles. The growing demands of society to conform to a certain image of womanhood created a stifling atmosphere for many women in the upper class. The pressure to marry well, maintain a perfect home, and adhere to the moral codes of the time often left little room for individuality or personal expression. Many women found their lives in these gilded cages emotionally taxing. They were trapped in roles that denied them autonomy, leaving some to find solace in quiet acts of rebellion, often through small gestures of defiance or by finding personal fulfillment in the charity work or social causes that became increasingly available to them in the late Victorian period. But despite the constraints of their social roles, the women of the upper class had access to an array of luxuries that made their existence far more comfortable than that of the working poor. Fashion, for example, was not just a form of self-expression. It was also an indicator of status. Women's wardrobes were filled with the finest silks, lace, and satin, often ordered from the most famous fashion houses in Paris. The The styles evolved throughout the Victorian era, from a voluminous skirt of the early years to the more structured designs of the late 1800s. Corsets, tight lacing, and layers of undergarments created a silhouette that was distinctively Victorian, with women spending hours each day dressing and perfecting their appearance. The wealthy also had the means to indulge in the pleasures of leisure. For the upper class, travel was an important aspect of their social lives, with many families owning country estates or taking seasonal vacations to resorts in Europe. These trips were opportunities for relaxation and entertainment, but also for maintaining social connections and reinforcing their status. The British Empire's vastness allowed the elite to travel to colonies in Africa, India, and the Caribbean, reinforcing the empire's dominance while indulging in the comforts of privileged life. In this way, their leisure activities were not simply about relaxation, but about maintaining and showcasing their place in the world order. Though their wealth insulated them from many of the pressures faced by the working class, the upper class in Victorian England was not immune to the larger forces of societal change. The increasing demands for workers' rights, the gradual suffrage movements, and the growing power of the middle class would eventually erode the aristocratic grip on British society. Yet, during the height of Victorian England, the upper class was able to maintain its social, political, and cultural dominance, continuing to shape the empire and the lives of those below them. In conclusion, the lives of the Victorian upper class were marked by both privilege and constraint, while their wealth allowed them to live in relative comfort. Free from many of the struggles faced by the working poor, they were bound by strict social conventions that dictated everything from marriage to leisure. The women were confined to the domestic sphere, while men carried the weight of their family's legacy on their shoulders. However, as the world began to change, even the aristocracy had to face the growing challenges to their way of life, and the influence they once held over society slowly began to wane. Part 3. As the Victorian era progressed, the upper class found themselves grappling with a growing sense of unease. The world they had long dominated was beginning to change, socially, economically, and politically, and the very foundations of their power and influence were being threatened by forces they could not entirely control. This shift in the social order would come to define the end of the Victorian period, marking the beginning of a new age in which the aristocracy, though still powerful, would no longer be the unquestioned rulers of British society. The Industrial Revolution, which had transformed the landscape of Britain, was a force that the upper class could not ignore. While they initially benefited from the economic prosperity generated by industrialization, through investments in factories, railroads, and mines, the growing wealth of the middle class began to challenge the aristocracy's dominance. The rise of factory owners, entrepreneurs, and bankers, many of whom had amassed significant fortunes through industry and commerce, presented a direct challenge to the old system of landed aristocracy. These newly wealthy individuals often lacked the breeding and social pedigree of the aristocrats, but their wealth gave them power, and they sought to buy their way into the circles of high society. The aristocracy, whose power had been rooted in land ownership and social connections, began to feel the pressure of this changing dynamic. While the landed gentry still controlled much of the land in the countryside, many aristocratic families had failed to adapt to the new industrial economy, and they were increasingly forced to sell off portions of their estates to maintain their lavish lifestyles. Some aristocrats, struggling to maintain their wealth, found themselves financially ruined, unable to keep up with the demands of their estates, the upkeep of their grand homes, and the lavish social events that defined their world. This period of social upheaval saw the upper class begin to confront their own vulnerability. Their traditional role as the ruling class of society was under threat as the middle class grew in number and influence. With the rise of industry came a new kind of power, political and economic power that was based not on birthright or tradition, but on wealth and the ability to navigate the changing world of business and politics. Many members of the upper class feared that the new money of the middle class would replace them as the cultural and political elite. In response to this growing anxiety, the aristocracy began to reassert their position, attempting to hold on to the old social order. They continued to cling to the traditions that had defined their status for generations: marriages within the elite, carefully curated social circles, and a strong emphasis on maintaining their family name. They also doubled down on the concept of the old virtues: respectability, honor, duty, and responsibility. The upper class clung to the idea that their wealth and influence were a result of their superior character and the responsibilities that came with their status. Even as their grip on power began to loosen, the relationship between the aristocracy and the newly emerging middle class was complex. On one hand, The wealth of the middle class was seen as a threat to the aristocracy, as it represented a shift in the source of power, from land and birthright to industry and commerce. On the other hand, the upper class was still dependent on the middle class for the labor that powered the industrial economy. The newly rich often sought social acceptance and recognition from the upper class, with many attempting to buy their way into high society through lavish parties, extravagant gifts, and the purchase of land and property. For women in the upper class, the challenge of maintaining their role in society was similarly complicated. As society began to shift toward a more modern and industrialized world, the role of women in the aristocracy was increasingly questioned. The traditional notion of women as caretakers of the home, mothers of heirs, and figures of moral authority was no longer sufficient to define a woman's place in society. In an era when women in other parts of the world were beginning to gain the right to vote and to participate in the workforce, the British aristocratic woman found herself caught between tradition and the changing social climate. As the suffrage movement gained momentum in the late 19th century, some women of the upper class began to question their own roles in society. While many of the aristocracy remained conservative in their views and resistant to change, others found ways to engage in charitable works, the arts, and even in political activism. The social reform movements of the time, which focused on labor rights, women's rights, and the welfare of the poor, created opportunities for women in the upper class to assert themselves outside of the domestic sphere. However, these opportunities were still tightly controlled and often aligned with the values of the aristocracy. The extent to which women of the upper class could affect true social change remained limited by the cultural expectations that governed their lives. The increasing importance of women in the social and political spheres marked a slow but unmistakable shift in Victorian society. While it would take many more years before women gained the right to vote, the movement for women's rights began to challenge the traditional power structures of the upper class, ultimately forcing the aristocracy to reckon with a new era in which women would play a more active role in public life. By the end of the Victorian era, the upper class had begun to confront the reality that their traditional way of life was no longer sustainable. The world was changing, and the old social order was giving way to new structures of power and influence. The middle class, with its newly acquired wealth, was increasingly asserting itself as a force to be reckoned with, and women were beginning to carve out their own place in the public sphere. The aristocracy, while still powerful, was slowly being replaced by new forms of leadership and influence. Yet, despite these shifts, the upper class remained a formidable force. Their legacy, built on centuries of tradition, wealth, and power, would continue to shape British society for years to come, even as the world around them evolved. In the midst of this social change, the Victorian upper class struggled to adapt to the new realities of the modern world. For some, it was a time of decline and adjustment, but for others, it was an opportunity to assert their relevance in a rapidly changing society. In the end, the lives of the Victorian upper class were marked by both their privilege and their vulnerability. They occupied a unique space in society, living in a lap of luxury while simultaneously grappling with the profound social, political, and economic changes that were reshaping the world. Their world may have seemed stable and secure, but it was in constant flux, and the changes they faced would ultimately signal the end of an era, marking the twilight of the old Victorian order and the dawn of a new age. Part 4. As the 19th century drew to a close, the Victorian upper class found themselves standing at the precipice of an era in transition. The familiar structures that had defined their world, their vast estates, their privileged positions within society, their exclusive access to wealth and power, were beginning to show signs of wear. The social upheavals brought about by industrialization, as well as the rise of democratic and reformist movements, were shaking the foundations of a system that had been largely unchallenged for centuries. For the upper class, this period of change was marked by an increasing sense of insecurity. The old certainties of land ownership and inherited wealth were less reliable than they had once been. The aristocracy had long prided itself on its control over land, but the rise of the middle class and the growing wealth generated by industry and trade began to erode that power. The new wealth of industrial magnates and businessmen created a new elite, one not bound by birthright, but by business acumen and entrepreneurial spirit. For many aristocrats, The fact that these men and women could rise to power without the pedigrees of old families was a source of anxiety. The industrialists, in their wealth and influence, were more than a challenge. They were an existential threat to the established order. The growing dominance of the middle class also signaled a shift in cultural values. While the upper class had long controlled cultural and political life, this new group began to challenge those boundaries, seeking more political representation, rights, and freedoms. The gradual expansion of suffrage, starting with the Reform Acts and culminating in the early 20th century, meant that more working-class men were given a vote, and the focus of politics began to shift from the aristocracy to a broader, more inclusive electorate. For the first time, the aristocracy had to reckon with the reality of society where the power of the wealthy elite was being diluted by the voices of the broader public. Within this changing social landscape, the role of women also evolved. While the Victorian upper class had long seen women as symbols of virtue and moral guardianship, the growing suffrage movement and calls for gender equality began to challenge this traditional view. Women in aristocracy, like their middle-class counterparts, were increasingly engaged in social reform, education, and charity work. Many women, particularly those from the upper classes, began to advocate for the rights of the poor, including the right to vote, better working conditions, and improved education. Figures such as Florence Nightingale, who revolutionized nursing, and Emmeline Pankhurst, who led the suffragette movement, emerged as powerful symbols of women's activism. This shift did not come easily. However, the aristocracy's deeply ingrained belief in the division of labor and the roles of men and women was resistant to change. Women, particularly those of the upper class, were still expected to be figures of domesticity, managing the home, raising children, and maintaining their social status through charity work and social engagements. But as the century wore on, more and more women began to assert themselves publicly. They became key figures in social and political movements, pushing for reforms and challenging the status quo. While many men in the upper class resisted this shift, fearing that the traditional gender roles they relied on would be undermined, others found themselves supporting these movements, especially as they began to realize that their privileged position could no longer be taken for granted. The continued presence of the aristocracy at the top of British society remained undeniable, but the signs of decline were clear. Economic challenges, including the inability of many aristocratic families to maintain their estates in the face of rising taxation and the demands of modernization, led some to sell off family lands and properties. Additionally, the increasing focus on urbanization and industry left many aristocratic families with little choice but to adapt. While many aristocrats had invested in new ventures or industrial enterprises, others found themselves with dwindling resources, unable to maintain the vast estates and social privileges that once defined them. Their long-established wealth, based primarily on land and tradition, was increasingly being replaced by wealth derived from business and industry. For the women of the upper class, this period of transition offered both challenges and opportunities. While many women still found their primary roles defined by the domestic sphere, others began to carve out their own spaces within the wider social, political, and intellectual realms. The arts, literature, and education began to see the emergence of influential women who challenged the traditional boundaries of what women could achieve. Women like the writer George Eliot and the social reformer Beatrice Webb became pioneers in fields traditionally dominated by men. These women were not content to be mere symbols of grace and virtue. They were using their platforms to address the pressing issues of their time, including poverty, labor rights, and the rights of women. At the same time, the upper class continued to uphold its most cherished values: tradition, lineage, and social standing. The fear of losing these privileges was palpable among many in the upper classes. Marriages were still largely arranged with an eye toward maintaining family status and securing wealth, even as the modern world encroached on their world of luxury and leisure. The notion of the ideal Victorian woman as a wife and mother, one who embodied purity, grace, and moral authority, remained prevalent, even as new ideas about gender equality and women's rights slowly began to take root. Despite the growing challenges they faced, many members of the upper class continued to cling to belief that their wealth and position were deserved, the result of centuries of history and achievement. This belief was often reinforced through the social structures and institutions that existed to preserve their power, whether it was through private clubs, charity work, or philanthropic endeavors. The aristocracy maintained a tight grip on cultural and social life, ensuring that they remained central figures in the narrative of Britain's greatness. As the Victorian era ended and the 20th century began, the upper class found themselves in a world that was increasingly unfamiliar. The political and economic changes that had begun during the reign of Queen Victoria were gathering momentum, and while the upper class was still rich and influential, they no longer held the same unquestioned authority they once had. The shift in power, both from the aristocracy to the industrial middle class, and from men to women in many spheres of life, was irrevocable. For the aristocracy, the dawn of the new century was not a time of unmitigated triumph, but rather a time of reckoning. The social structure that had held firm for so long was beginning to crack, and the upper class had to adapt or risk losing their position in society altogether.